The dog had stopped breathing. The family was crying. The little boy refused to leave his best friend's side, and then, just 1 minute later, something impossible happened. We've all heard stories about the unbreakable bond between kids and their pets. But what you're about to see today, it's something else. This isn't just a sad story. It's a story about love, loss, and a moment so unbelievable, you'll hold your breath until the very end. The Johnson family never imagined their world could shatter so quickly. Max, their golden retriever, had been with them through everything. Birthdays, holidays, lazy Sundays, and even the toughest days, when all anyone needed was a warm, furry friend to lean on. For 8 wonderful years, Max wasn't just a pet, he was the glue that held the Johnson family together. Every morning began with his cold, nose-nudging sleepy hands for attention. Every evening ended with his warm body curled at the foot of Jake's bed, standing guard like a furry sentinel. The creak of his dog tags had become the soundtrack of their home, a constant reminder of his loving presence. Max had this uncanny ability to sense emotions. When Sarah, Jake's mom, had lost her father 2 years ago, it was Max who stayed pressed against her side for days, absorbing her tears into his golden fur. When David, Jake's dad, got laid off from work, Max would bring his favorite toy to him every evening, as if to say, at least we still have each other. And Jake and Max shared a bond so deep it transcended words. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, the unthinkable happened. It started subtly. Max didn't come bounding into the kitchen when Sarah opened the can of dog food, his usual breakfast time ritual. Instead, he remained lying on his bed in the living room, his breathing slightly labored. Jake, then just 7 years old, knelt beside his best friend. "Mom, Max doesn't want to play," Jake called out, his small hand stroking Max's head with gentle concern. Sarah's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She crouched down beside her son and their beloved dog, noticing how Max's normally bright eyes seemed dull, how his tail gave only the weakest thump in greeting. The next 48 hours were a blur of growing panic. Max refused his favorite treats. He struggled to stand up without assistance. His breathing became increasingly ragged. The family canceled all plans, taking turns sitting with Max, offering water from their hands, whispering words of encouragement. The trip to the animal hospital was a nightmare in slow motion. David carried Max to the car, the dog's once muscular frame, now frighteningly light, in his arms. Jake sat in the back seat with Max's head cradled in his lap, his small fingers compulsively smoothing the fur between Max's ears the way he knew his friend loved. Sarah kept glancing back, her eyes reflecting the same terror they all felt, but couldn't voice. The waiting room at the veterinary hospital seemed to stretch time itself. Every tick of the clock echoed like a hammer blow. When Dr. Reynolds finally emerged, her face told them everything before she even spoke. The diagnosis was devastating: advanced cardiomyopathy. Max's heart was simply giving out. "We can make him comfortable," Dr. Reynolds said gently, "but I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do medically." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah collapsed into David's arms, her body racked with silent sobs. David's strong facade crumbled as tears streamed down his weathered face. But Jake stood frozen, his small face pale with shock, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "No," Jake whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "You're wrong. Max can't leave," he promised. The memory of that promise hung heavy in the air. Just last month, when Jake had been afraid of monsters under his bed, Max had slept right beside him all night. "You'll always protect me, right, Max?" Jake had asked sleepily, his small hand buried in golden fur. Max had responded with a soft woof and a lick to Jake's cheek, a vow sealed in dog language. Now, as the family gathered around Max in the sterile examination room, that promise felt like the only thing holding their world together. The vet administered pain medication to keep Max comfortable in his final moments. Sarah and David each took turns saying their goodbyes, their voices breaking as they thanked Max for his years of unconditional love. But when it came Jake's turn, the little boy did something that shattered what remained of his parents' hearts. Instead of speaking, he carefully climbed onto the examination table and laid down beside Max, curling his small body around his dying friend just like they did every night at home. He pressed his forehead against Max's, his tears dampening the dog's fur. "Please, Max," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please don't go. I need you." The room fell silent except for the slow, irregular beeping of the heart monitor. Sarah reached for David's hand, both parents helpless in the face of their son's grief. The vet stood quietly by, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then something extraordinary happened. Just as the monitor's beeps began to space further apart, signaling Max's heart was failing, Jake let out a quiet sob and buried his face in Max's neck. At that exact moment, Max's tail gave one weak but unmistakable thump against the table. Then another. Then, the heart monitor's rhythm changed. The beeps grew stronger, more regular. Dr. Reynolds' head snapped up in shock. That's impossible," she murmured, reaching for her stethoscope with shaking hands. As she listened to Max's chest, her eyes widened in disbelief. His heartbeat, it stabilizing. Over the next few minutes, the entire room watched in stunned silence as Max's breathing deepened. His eyes, which had grown dull with pain, began to regain some of their familiar sparkle. Most miraculously of all, when Jake whispered his name, Max managed to lift his head just enough to lick Jake's tear-streaked face. What happened next defied all medical explanation. Over the coming days, Max's recovery wasn't just emotional, it was physical. His heart function improved dramatically. His energy returned. The vet ran test after test, but could find no scientific reason for the sudden reversal of his condition. All they knew was that in that critical moment when Jake refused to say goodbye, something miraculous had occurred. The Johnson family didn't need test results or medical explanations. They knew the truth in their hearts. Max had come back because Jake's love, their family's love, had reached him in that space between life and whatever comes after. Some bonds, it seemed, were simply too strong for even death to break. The sterile white walls of the veterinary clinic seemed to close in around the Johnson family as they gathered around Max's still body. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made Max's golden fur look paler than ever. The antiseptic smell that usually lingered in the air was now mixed with something more primal. The scent of grief, of salt from falling tears, of the last warm moments with a beloved family member. Sarah, Jake's mom, had one hand covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her other hand clutched David's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. David, normally the rock of the family, found himself crumbling as he gently held Max's limp paw between both of his large, work-roughened hands. His tears fell freely onto the examination table as he whispered, "Good boy, such a good boy," his voice breaking on every word. But Jake stood frozen beside the table, his small frame trembling. His blue eyes, usually so full of mischief and joy, were wide with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Not to Max, not to his best friend, the dog who had slept beside him through every thunderstorm, who had patiently let Jake dress him in ridiculous costumes, who had been there for every scraped knee and bad dream. Then something inside the 7-year-old snapped. Without a word, Jake climbed onto the examination table with a determination that startled his parents. The vet moved to stop him, but something in the child's expression made her pause. Carefully, as if handling the most precious treasure in the world, Jake laid down beside Max's motionless body. He curled his small frame against Max's side exactly as he did every night in bed, his head resting near Max's shoulder, one arm draped protectively over the dog's chest. The room fell completely silent except for Sarah's quiet weeping. Jake pressed his cheek against Max's fur, still warm but growing cooler by the minute. He closed his eyes tight and whispered words only Max could hear. "Please wake up, Max. Please. You can't go. Remember when you ate my birthday cake and Mom got so mad but we laughed? Remember when we built a blanket fort and you guarded it all night? You have to wake up, Max. I still need you to teach me how to be brave." A single tear rolled down Jake's nose and disappeared into Max's fur. For a long moment, a moment that stretched into eternity for the broken-hearted family, nothing happened. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. The vet shifted uncomfortably. David reached out to gently pull Jake away. Then, a twitch, so slight it could have been imagination, but Jake felt it. His eyes flew open as Max's front leg jerked slightly beneath his hand. "Dad," Jake gasped, sitting up so fast he nearly fell off the table. "Dad," he moved. Sarah choked back a sob. "Oh, honey," she began, her voice thick with grief, thinking her son was in denial. But then, Max's chest rose, not the shallow, irregular breaths from before. A real breath, a deep one, then another. David's mouth fell open. "Doctor," he managed to croak out. The vet, who had been preparing the paperwork, rushed back to the table, her stethoscope already in her ears. When she pressed it to Max's chest, her eyebrows shot up in shock. That's impossible," she murmured. His heart, it's beating again. The change came over Max slowly but unmistakably. First, his breathing deepened and steadied. Then, the faintest flicker of movement beneath his eyelids. Then, the moment that made Sarah scream with joy, the very tip of Max's tail gave the smallest, weakest wag. Jake, still perched on the table, threw his arms around Max's neck. "I knew it. I knew you'd come back," he cried, his voice muffled against Max's fur. Over the next hour, the veterinary clinic transformed from a place of mourning to a scene of bewildered celebration. Max's vital signs continued improving at a rate that defied all medical logic. The vet ran test after test, shaking her head in disbelief at each result. "Medically, this makes no sense," she admitted to the Johnsons. By all accounts, Max was gone. His heart had stopped. There was no brain activity. And now, she gestured to where Max was weakly but determinedly licking Jake's face as the boy giggled through his tears. Now he's responding like a dog who just woke up from a deep nap. As the family prepared to take Max home, against medical advice, as the vet insisted on keeping him overnight for observation, Jake refused to leave his friend's side. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the exam room, Max's head cradled in his lap, gently stroking the velvety ears he thought he'd never feel again. "Mom," Jake asked quietly as Sarah knelt beside him, Do you think Max came back because he heard me?" Sarah looked at her son, then at their miracle dog, then back at her son. Her voice was steady when she answered, but her eyes shone with tears of a different kind now. "I think, sweetheart, that some loves are so strong, not even heaven can keep them apart." That night, as the Johnson family slept, all of them curled together on the living room floor around Max, unwilling to let him out of their sight. Max opened his eyes in the darkness. Weak but determined, he stretched his neck forward and licked Jake's cheek once, a silent promise renewed. Then, with a contented sigh that sounded almost human, he settled back down to sleep, his breathing perfectly in sync with the little boy who had loved him back to life. While the Johnsons chose to see Max's recovery as nothing short of miraculous, veterinary experts later theorized about several rare but documented medical phenomena that might explain what happened. Transient cardiac arrest. Some dogs experience temporary heart stoppages that can spontaneously reverse, especially when stimulated by strong emotional or physical triggers, like Jake's body heat and emotional connection. Deep coma state. Max may have entered an extremely deep coma that mimicked death, with Jake's presence and touch helping restart his nervous system. Unexplained neurological reboot. There are rare cases where a dying animal's brain sends out one final surge of electrical activity that can temporarily restart failed systems. But to the Johnson family, none of that mattered. What mattered was the warm, living weight of Max resting against them that night, and every night after. What mattered was the way Max would look at Jake sometimes, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets no human could ever understand. What mattered was the second chance they'd all been given, because sometimes, just sometimes, love really is enough to work miracles. The days that followed Max's impossible return were filled with moments so profound they etched themselves permanently into the Johnson family's memory. Each morning dawned brighter than the last, as if the universe itself was celebrating their miracle. When the Johnsons finally brought Max home from the veterinary hospital, the golden retriever moved slowly, but purposefully through the familiar rooms. His nose twitched as he rediscovered scents he'd thought he'd never smell again. The faint trace of peanut butter on Jake's school backpack, the lavender fabric softener Sarah used on the couch blankets, the oil and metal scent that always clung to David's work boots. But the most remarkable moment came when Max paused at the foot of the stairs. With visible effort, he climbed each step one by one until he reached Jake's bedroom. There, he collapsed onto the well-worn dog bed that had molded perfectly to his shape over the years, exhaling a sigh that seemed to say, "I'm home." Sarah prepared Max's breakfast with trembling hands, a quarter portion of his regular kibble mixed with boiled chicken, just as the vet had recommended. When she set the bowl down, the entire family held their breath. Max sniffed at the food tentatively, then looked up at Jake with tired but clear eyes. It was Jake who understood first. "He wants me to hand-feed him," the boy said, scooping up a piece of chicken. As Max gently took the morsel from Jake's fingers, Sarah had to turn away to hide her tears. This was how Max had eaten when they first brought him home as a puppy, and now history was repeating itself in the most beautiful way. David was the first to witness it, the moment Max's tail regained its full, joyful mobility. He'd been massaging Max's hindquarters, a technique the vet suggested to improve circulation, when suddenly, without warning, that magnificent golden plume began thumping against the floor. Not the weak, half-hearted movements from before, but real, honest-to-goodness tail wags. David's booming laugh brought Sarah and Jake running. and what followed was a family hug with Max at the center, his tail never stopping its rhythmic beat against the hardwood. Dr. Reynolds' jaw actually dropped during Max's follow-up examination. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 23 years, she murmured as she reviewed the test results, "and I've never seen anything like this. Every indicator, heart rate, blood work, neurological responses, showed a healthy, aging dog. No signs of the catastrophic organ failure that should have taken his life." When she asked permission to document Max's case for veterinary journals, the Johnsons agreed on one condition, that the records would list Jake as the primary treatment provider. The true miracle revealed itself in the ordinary moments. Max waiting by the door when Jake came home from school, the familiar jingle of his tags as he patrolled the backyard, the way he still managed to sneak onto the couch when he thought no one was looking. But the most profound moment came that night, when Jake got ready for bed. Max, without any prompting, climbed up and settled into his usual spot at the foot of the bed. As Jake reached down to stroke his head, Max did something extraordinary. He caught Jake's hand gently in his mouth, holding it with just enough pressure to say, "I'm here. I'm staying." It was an old game they used to play when Jake was younger, one they hadn't done in years. It was Sarah who first noticed the change in Max's behavior toward Jake. While the golden retriever was affectionate with all of them, his interactions with Jake had taken on a new quality. Max was more attentive, more protective, almost purposeful in his actions. He positioned himself between Jake and any perceived danger, including the neighbor's scary tabby cat. He woke from sleep the instant Jake stirred. He even started herding Jake away from the street with gentle nudges, something he'd never done before. One evening, as Sarah watched Max follow Jake from room to room with unwavering focus, the realization hit her like a lightning bolt. She called David into the kitchen where they could talk privately. "He came back for Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not for us, for Jake." David nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "That's why the vet couldn't explain it, because what brought Max back wasn't medicine. It was love," Sarah finished. "Pure, unconditional love." In the weeks that followed, Max's recovery became the talk of their small town. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and well wishes. Local news did a heartwarming segment, but through it all, Max remained steadfastly by Jake's side, his living testament to the power of love. The vet called it a medical miracle. The news called it extraordinary. The Johnsons, they called it exactly what it was: the beautiful, mysterious, awe-inspiring bond between a boy and his dog. A bond so strong it defied death itself. A bond that would continue to grow stronger with every passing day. Because Max didn't just come back to life, he came back for Jake. But as Jake would tell you when asked about his best friend's incredible journey, sometimes magic is just love that nobody understands yet. And maybe that's the most scientific explanation of all. In the months that followed Max's impossible return, the Johnson household settled into a new normal, one where every ordinary moment felt extraordinary. The coffee mugs no longer rattled when Max's tail thumped against the kitchen cabinets. But now the family would stop whatever they were doing to smile at the sound. Sarah found herself taking more videos than photos, wanting to preserve not just images, but the living proof of Max's presence. The way his ears perked up when Jake laughed, the contented sigh he made when curling up in his favorite sunspot. David started a journal, documenting what he called Max's second life. Page after page filled with small miracles. The first time Max barked at the mailman again, day 17. When he stole a whole loaf of bread from the counter and looked genuinely guilty about it, day 29. How he somehow knew to be extra gentle when playing with Jake after the boy got his tonsils out, day 63. Each entry ended the same way. Still here, still perfect. Jake, now 8 years old, became the family's resident expert on what he called the rules of love. One afternoon, as Sarah helped him write a school essay about Max's recovery, he explained it with startling clarity. "Max didn't come back because he forgot to die," Jake said, his small hands carefully forming each letter. "He came back because we forgot to stop loving him. Love doesn't know about dying. Love only knows about loving." Sarah had to leave the room to compose herself. When she returned, she found Max had rested his head on Jake's lap, his soulful eyes watching the boy's pencil move across the paper, as if making sure the story was told right. Dr. Reynolds became a regular visitor to the Johnson home, though her visits gradually shifted from medical checkups to something closer to friendship. She brought veterinary students with her sometimes, letting them examine Max, while quietly explaining that what they were seeing defied every textbook. Her professional skepticism had given way to respectful awe. I used to believe medicine could explain everything, she confessed to David one evening over coffee. But Max, he's my living reminder that some mysteries are meant to stay beautiful. Word of Max's miracle spread through their small town like wildfire. At first, it was just neighbors stopping by with treats for the special dog. Then came the cards from strangers who'd heard the story. Eventually, the Johnsons started finding small tokens left on their porch, handwritten notes about pets people had lost, asking Max to say hello to them in whatever way dogs can. Sarah began collecting these notes in a beautiful wooden box, recognizing that their story had become something bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about giving people permission to believe in the impossible, to hope beyond reason. As seasons turned, the family noticed subtle but profound ways Max's journey had altered them. David quit his high-stress job to start a dog training business, realizing life was too precious to spend unhappy. Sarah began volunteering at the local animal shelter, bringing Jake along to read to anxious dogs waiting for homes. Jake, once shy, now confidently told Max's story to anyone who asked, his young voice steady with conviction. Max himself seemed different too, not just in his renewed health, but in his demeanor. There was a quiet wisdom in his eyes now, a patience that hadn't been there before. When neighborhood kids came over, he'd let them climb all over him with endless tolerance. But his watchful gaze never strayed far from Jake. As Max grew older, his muzzle graying and step slowing, the family found they could face his eventual passing with peace rather than terror. They'd learned the ultimate lesson, that love isn't measured in years but in moments, not in goodbyes but in hellos. Whether Max lived one more day or 10 more years, they knew now that some bonds truly are stronger than life itself. Because here's the secret Max taught them. He didn't come back to life for Jake. He showed them that in all the ways that matter, he'd never left. Love like theirs doesn't die. It changes form. It takes breaks. It plays hide and seek. But it never ever ends. And so the story continues. Not with an ending, but with a comma. Max is here. Jake is loved. The sun rises each morning on a world where miracles walk among us on 4 paws, reminding us with every wag of their tails that the most powerful force in the universe might just be the bond between a boy and his dog. If your eyes aren't at least a little watery right now, you might want to check if you still have a pulse. Smash that subscribe button, because miracles like this, they're why we hit upload.